Yeah, I see it going. I see the seconds ticking away. Story of our lives, isn't it? I do appreciate all of you being here. I noticed last week that there were some things that were a little fuzzy. You may not have noticed it. They may have just been fuzzy because you had no idea what I was talking about. But I missed some things I wanted to do on genetics at the end. So I'm going to sort of summarize that first one and part of that second lesson because we're going to need it for this third lesson. This is a series. It makes it difficult sometimes. But anyway, I'd been getting over something. I don't know what it was, and I actually thought I was over it. And apparently I wasn't. Oh, don't want to do that. Okay. So we have D sub. Oh, it disappeared. Okay. What you need to understand is where I've been kind of going with this lesson. It's a little confusing for me because I could point either direction, and I can't do that or I'll get dizzy. I'll tell you that right off the bat. So what we've been talking about is the fact that there are how many theories of evolution? 3. All right. So if I said single cell to man, what would you call that? General. Okay. And if I said natural selection, what would you call that? Special. And if I said life from non-life, what would you say? Chemical. And a lot of people do not understand that those 3 concepts are separate in and of themselves. They must be proven in and of themselves. It doesn't do you any good to say, well, obviously natural selection occurred, therefore general evolution occurred, or that natural selection occurred, and if you trace that back, obviously a naturalistic way of looking at the world means that at some point life had to come from nothing. What was dead had to become alive. That has not been proven either. And so it's an important thing. I'm trying to get people to see that when it comes to, well, let's talk about general evolution for a moment. In general evolution, the idea is that non-living became living. And then from that original non-living and then living organism, everything else branched off. And if you look at these tips and nodes where we see them today, that's where all life came from. Started out, it wasn't, it became living, and then it became everything that we know today. That's the general theory. And so it really requires a natural creation, not a supernatural. And we'll be touching on that a number of places. The concept of what supernatural means. A lot of people struggle with that word. If you think about a supernatural creation, meaning something outside of the natural world brought the natural world into existence and created something like the kinds. And we touched on that in our last lesson to point out to you that the kind is not the species, which was a mistake that was made not because of general evolutionists, but because of a very fervent special creationist. Somebody who believed in the Bible and who looked at it literally and basically said if God was perfect, God would not have created anything to where it could change because he would have done it perfectly. And what he didn't understand was that the Bible very clearly in Genesis 30 and 31 shows that Jacob not only understood the concept of artificial and natural selection, but he understood the idea of breeding. So that goes back a long way when you consider that that's the same book that tells us about the creation and tells us about the flood account. All right, these people were not ignorant people. And I can't go over that again, but I'd be glad to talk to anybody who has problems with seeing that. Anyway, so if you start with the kinds of organisms that God created, and then you look at some natural selection from there due to pressures that are in the environment, then basically you end up with the same tips and nodes that you're trying to explain. You know, there's human species, that is a species, and that is a kind. And that's one that you can show from the scriptures, that humans are a kind and we are a species. And that was part of what happened with with Lamarck, with Linnaeus. He just had this idea that if it was that way for the human species and it's a kind, then it had to be that way for all organisms. But it isn't. And even in Genesis, you can point to the passages that show that. So this is where we're going. We have three theories. We have, the idea of non-life becoming life, the chemical evolution. Then from that original life, that you would have natural selection or special changes, and the general theory would tie them all together. All right, and in supernatural creation, special theory, you have the idea of natural selection, but it starts from the kind. All right, there's still change, but it's change within limits. And that's what we emphasized last time, was this idea of change is there. And I'm going to give you an example that I didn't give you last time on that particular topic. I was down in Chipley, Florida. Now, you may not know. Does anybody here know where Chipley, Florida is? A little bit southwest of Two Egg, Alabama. Did that help? Apparently not. If you go, Florida is a very interesting state. First of all, next big flood, it's going to be not a state anymore. It's just going to be cut off from the continental United States. But it's very, very long from Miami up to the top of Florida, and it's also very long this way. It goes all the way across the Gulf Coast to Mobile, Alabama. And that western panhandle, if you follow 10, which is the major highway, it goes all the way across the state from Jacksonville to Mobile. You basically pass through Chipley. Oh, you just missed it. That's all it took to get through Chipley. But I was doing a meeting down there, and one of my friends, Dr. Cutts, was there, and he asked a question about the idea of quail. He says, I had the most interesting experience, and I'd like to know what you think about this. He said, we used to go hunting in what we called quail paradise. It was these fields outside of town here in Chipley, and you could go out and you could get your quota easily in the morning. The dogs would go across, they'd scare them up. It was automatic. You knew you were going to get your full quota. And he said, about 25 years after we did that, we decided to go back and do that again. Come back and go to quail paradise together. When you get about 25 years out from your youth, you'll understand why people do that. We like to go back to the things that meant a lot to us when we were young. And he said, we couldn't scare any quail up, but we could hear them run off in the brush. Now, I've had a lot of quail hunters who've told me that that's actually true. Not all quail fly up. And so he said, what would be the explanation for them not flying up? And I said, well, if you look at the buckshot as sort of a selection pressure, what happened over the years? Can somebody tell me? The ones that didn't fly up had the genetics passed on to the next generation. Remember, I told you that evolution doesn't occur with an individual. It occurs with differences within the population. All you have to do is look around this room and see that no two of us are exactly alike. So if there's a pressure on us, like getting to the donut shop first, some of us will not get there first. There's 3 or 4 here I see sitting in the front. Oh, yeah, that young lady over there, too, who will get to the donut shop before us. And I'll probably drag in later, hobbling. So the point is, if my survival, if my genetic survival depended on whether I could get to a food source, and there were others that were genetically faster and more apt to get to that food first, then my genetics would die out of the population. If I didn't have any children, it wouldn't be passed on. You have to remember that your ancestors were the ones who survived. When my grandmother was born, it was around 1895. My grandfather in 1873. And at that time, without antibiotics and without immunizations, a woman would lose half of her children before the age of 10. And so your ancestors were the ones who survived. And the genetics for the ones who did not survive changed the scope of the population. That's basically natural selection. And I mentioned it last time because I hear people say, I wonder why we have so much autism, or we have this, or we have that. And to me, it's a very simple thing from a scientific point of view, and even from a biblical point of view, that we are keeping ourselves alive with antibiotics and immunizations, something that we as humans want, right? I had a friend who had a baby that was right at a pound, and that baby was in the hospital forever. I can't remember how long it was before the baby was able to come home. It was hooked up to every kind of tube, and it was just amazing. I remember seeing the dad take off his ring, and it slipped over the baby's foot, not a toe or anything, over the whole foot. And so, PJ, what would you expend if that was your child to keep it alive? Just about anything, right? And I always try to remind people that that's the way God looks at you and I, you and me. Yeah, sorry. Don't be looking at my grammar. You're going to get really discouraged. Anyway, that's the way God views us. He would do anything in order for us to be able to be saved and to take care of us. He would just take care of us. He'd even take care of those who weren't obedient to him. He'd let good things happen to bad people, and there is a reason why bad things happen to good people, because evil's in the world. So what I want you to understand is that this idea of things being selected out is pretty easy. So in the thing with the quail, the ones that were runners lived to run and to pass on their genetics, and the ones that were flyers got blown out of the air. That was the selection pressure. Now that's natural selection. All right, if that goes on long enough, you'll end up with 2 new species. All right. So if you look at these Arctic tern, where their population goes all the way around the Earth at the northern climes, if you look at this end of it and go all the way around to the other end of it, those 2 ends will not breed anymore. So it's easy enough to see that if something broke that chain, you would have gone from 1 species to 2. But that's not enough to show that general evolution occurred. All right, that's a limited kind of change, and it changes it maybe from 1 species to another. In our view, maybe they can't breed anymore, which is the classic way of showing it. And but it's not unlimited change. So we had a discussion about unlimited change. See, I don't stutter, but my slides do. That's what we decided. We're not really sure what the problem is on that. It may be a ballast someplace. So the question was whether Darwin got it wrong. A Nova program on TV, where there was a narrator who would ask these questions, and he said, can Macbeth, Norman Macbeth, who was being interviewed, fault the evolutionist logic? And he says, no, it's not so much their logic. That really isn't too bad. What I do is work more on the way they handle their evidence. Does that sound familiar? That's what I've been talking about now. For instance, there's the practice called extrapolation. There's another big word for you that you can learn called extrapolation. Observing the animals, the breeders, for a few years, about 20 years roughly, Darwin saw they were making a lot of improvements in sheep and dogs and pigeons and aspidistras. You'll look that one up on your own. That's a take-home assignment. Darwin saw that they were making a lot of improvements. And what he did is he took that 20 years of experience and he said, if we give nature several 100 million years, there's just no limit. There it is right there. Remember, none of these quotes come from my own material. This is all stuff from things that have been talked about in general evolution discussions. There's just no limit to what nature can do, but it didn't work out in practice. That's an unjustified procedure. They discover that when you look actually at the results that after a certain time, if you breed animals very carefully, they either become sterile or they snap back to the original form. Now, I'm pretty sure I said every bit of that last time. And this is not a creationist speaking here. Okay? This is a lawyer who would go around to evolutionary conferences and he would challenge scientists on how they interpreted and used their evidence. And that's what we talked about last time. You put the evidence out on a table in a court case, you have both the prosecuting attorney and the defense attorney looking at the exact same evidence and offering two entirely different conclusions, two different interpretations. And if they cannot eliminate the other person's interpretation, you get a hung jury. You simply don't know. So what I've been trying to do is to present an alternative explanation using the very evidence that my professor of advanced evolutionary theory gave us in class. And that's what we've done. We've looked at comparative anatomy. We'll come back to that tonight. And we've looked at genetics, and certainly the genetics of organisms are very much the same. What really struck me at one time was that every topic I talk about goes back to interpretation when you're comparing similarities in organisms, whether it's molecular genetics or whether it's just the morphology of an ape or and a human or a horse and a human. It's all the same thing. So he says, well, what's the biggest problem? He says, well, the most important problem to my mind is their failure to make a dent in the problem of macroevolution, which is what creationists tend to use the word macro as opposed to general, but I use general and special because they're in the scientific literature. Okay? Micro, little changes in the beak or a feather, slight improvement in rows, for instance, isn't any great problem. It isn't even a very important problem. It's those big changes, such as a little tree shrew moving to being a big whale or from a reptile to a mammal. Those are the really important things. And they've not found anything to help on that. That was where he went after this part of the discussion. So I want you to understand that the issue is not whether you have changes in the genetic frequency within the entire gene pool, which is the population, okay? That's not the issue. What the issue is whether or not you can get limited versus unlimited genetic change. So you can get your runners and your flyers, and you can go from runners to flyers, and then if you stop shooting at them, you may go back to having runners and flyers again. And that's all right, but that is not what is needed for general evolution. You need a reptile to become a bird, and from that reptile becoming a bird, you need to go to butterflies and cockroaches. There's some amazing things that have to happen, including becoming man. All right? You know, I've listened to a lot of gospel preachers, and I love to listen to gospel preachers do their lessons. I have never heard another gospel preacher mention a roach in their lessons. So that is a very unique thing that you got out of this, the roaches. Remember, when you spray for roaches, the ones that die are the ones that cannot handle it, but there's always one that seems to live. Same with bacteria, right? We're fighting viruses right now that change regularly. All right, so that's not the real issue. My friend Frank Lovell, who is an atheist, I want to say, was debating Buddy Payne, and he said, now we know today that mutations can alter species in every imaginable way. Science has not discovered any law of nature that puts a limit on the altering effects of mutations. No limit has been discovered. And so last time I tried to get that across, but I didn't finish it. This is general evolution, and at some point we'll deal with paleontology, because I know that's a very complex chart. But the reason I like it is that it is exactly the same today, in spite of all of the science that has been done. The chart is still like this, and there are dotted lines between all the groups. There are no intermediate fossils. Darwin noticed it, and he said, there's two things I'm worried about. You don't have any fossils down here in the Precambrian, what was called the cryptozoic, the hidden life one. And he said, and there's no intermediate fossils. And unless those two things are filled in, then you're going to have to drop my general theory. All right, and it hasn't been. We'll come back to that another time. This is the general theory based on Kirkut, and that's where I got my terms general and special. On the other hand, there is a theory that all the living forms in the world have arisen from a single source, which itself came from an inorganic form. Inorganic meaning dead, right? Not alive. Okay. So you have chemical evolution, and then they basically talk only about general evolution. One source, all the branching. I have no problem with the branching. I just believe there's a limit to it, and it didn't start with a single source. It started with a multiple source. And the question is, well, why would they all look so much alike? What was the answer that I helped you with that I think is a good answer on the first night in comparative anatomy? What was the answer to all this similarity, Todd? Everything has to have a food source. Everything on this earth is within this huge web of life, and everything has to have a food source, and it serves as food for other things, right? And if that's true, then you would expect a chemical similarity, the same kinds of molecules. And if the molecules are the same, then the proteins and enzymes and all the structural things would have to be the same, and those are used to make organs, and the organs are made to make an organism, or that's the way it would have to work. So I'm just bringing that up again because this is the only thing I don't believe. Okay, I don't believe in chemical, and I don't believe that you can go and find unlimited change to get from one point to another. There is no such thing as an unlimited change. The similarity doesn't bother me, and you'll see that again tonight. So here are the two that we talked about. My wife always wants me to show this simply because the special theory, here are the kinds. So you have change and variation within the kinds, a population of some sort. The general theory says you can go from one to the other to another, but the idea of change within the kind does not violate the scriptures in any way. Okay? Well, I talked about that. So unlimited, that's where we were a minute ago. I talked about this idea of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and how we get this idea of things being able to change. And the problem is that a good science fiction writer takes you from imagination to reality very smoothly by using the science very cleverly. But it isn't real. And so your greatest risk of radiation overdosing is in the doctor and the dentist's office. It's not in the waste disposal sites unless you decide to go and dig in there. Okay, but and it's not a power plant. All right, and it's not high tension wires that hurt you. The radiation basically from those doctors and dentist office, if it is not shielded properly, would be your greatest exposure outside of the sun. So it didn't turn me into anything weird. Did it? Well, we'll not answer that question at the moment. Anyway, the pea pod, this is where I want to go. Mendel actually used pea plants, and he had a select number of characters, say 7 sets of characters, where it was white or it was red, it was wrinkled or it was smooth in the fruits and so on. And he was very careful in his breeding on this. And he came up with some proportions that have lasted through the years in Mendelian genetics, these 3-to-1 ratios or 1-to-2-to-1. And what he discovered was that genetics was not something that you got from your parents in some kind of a long sequence. There were very discrete types of how we look. You either have the gene for balding or you don't. Hair loss, there's like 21 different kinds of patterns for hair loss. All right, that's a genetic thing. But there's differences. There's differences in the melanin, the amount of melanin that is laid down in a person's skin or in their eyes. And that is purely a genetic thing. All right, male and female, purely a genetic thing, and so on. And so it was very discrete. All right, and modern day genetics was based on that. And so the other thing that was used so much was this thing about the Drosophila, these little fruit flies. This is an experiment that any one of your kids can do if they'll just put some baby fruit flies with a banana in the refrigerator and follow the generations of them, as long as your mom doesn't mind too much. But there's lots of people who've been doing these experiments for a long time. You may not understand that Thomas Hunt Morgan, and that's the name of the science building over here in Lexington, Thomas Hunt Morgan was the one who started that research back in 1910. And what he's done is people have gone through millions of populations, millions of generations of fruit flies in all of these experiments, both scientific and a little less scientific that the kids do for science fair projects and so on. But there have been a lot of changes. And this concept, basically, this is Drosophila melanogaster. It'll be simple little changes like the length of the thorax or something like that. So they would cross them. They'd know what the genetics was. And they would say, okay, you can only get one of these. And they'd cross and they'd come up with all of their answers. And it was very predictable, extremely predictable. You could say, I should get this. And every once in a while, they'd have a mutation. And part of the reason they have a mutation is that they would douse them with chemicals, they'd douse them with radiation to get the genetics to change and so on. All right, so we got this radiation thing in there. And so you can get curly wings, stubby wings, yellow body color, different body colors, eye color, lethal conditions where they know that they should have been there, but they know they died. And then you have the wild type flies. And so if you look at it, here are the eyes. You can go from this to a normal eye. So from the normal eye, you can get all the way up to here to where they have no eye. On the wings, you can go from these normal wings all the way up here to these stubby ones. And the last thing they created was a four-winged Drosophila. All right. The first thing I want you to know is none of these can live in the wild. Whatever change they make, it's worse. All right, so it's the same thing in breeding, right? You can breed it, but you have to keep it confined and taken care of. If you put it in the wild, it's either going to die or it will bounce back. And the same thing was true here. That four-winged thing, they say it means that it came from some kind of four-winged insect, and the truth is, it can't walk. The four-winged thing doesn't fly better, it just can't walk. So it's not likely to have been the ancestor or have come from an ancestor like that. So this is part of the problem. Now, I have no problem with this until students are not told certain things, like these are not beneficial in the wild. It seems to me that's a simple enough statement to make to students. And I'm not going to say they're dishonest. I just want you to understand that when you've heard something for so long, it is so difficult to think differently. I have friends who religiously differ from me. Lots of friends who are Roman Catholic, lots of friends who are Pentecostals. They don't see things the same way I do. And I know when I was a Presbyterian, I did not see things the way I do now. You know, I had to study through the scriptures and let the scriptures be my only guide, not what somebody said about the scriptures. All right, and that's the whole key of going back to the evidence here. You go back to the evidence, and then you work your way from the evidence, and you look at every possibility. All right, you don't say that somebody's dishonest because they have not looked at every possibility. You just help them study from the source of truth. That's what we do religiously. The trouble is you don't really have that in science. We have evidence, and it always gets interpreted, no matter what you do. So anyway, I've always been interested in this. This, because I was using the pictures, is the entire family at Christmas. That was meant to be funny. Okay, let me write a note down on that one. But we know that this has become almost hilarious with people like Gary Larson. Here, drink this. Look at them, and the idea that radiation and chemicals can change you to make you different. It's that simple idea of that goo, that ooze from the sewer, actually creating the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Well, it doesn't happen that way. All right. Warning: underground nuclear test area. And this is what you get from your golfers. He was very good at that. He took care of it. And I talked to you last time about having such a highly tuned car like this Formula One racer, or yourself. We are the most highly tuned things that I know of. And you can't just shoot a bullet through us without getting some bad changes. You can't shoot a bullet through that engine without getting a bad change. The likelihood of it actually improving the car or improving you is pretty low, right? So we're not going to be improved by getting zapped with radiation. What we know is that's part of what creates our aging process. Just constant exposure to radiation source. So this was what I was trying to tell you about. I found it. It was on my next lesson. History is crowded with men who would be gods, but only one God who would become man. I just wanted to show that to you, first of all, to prove that I wasn't lying, and secondly, because I think it has a great impact for people. Okay, so that'll be in there. People can get to it. Now let's talk about fossil men, because where we're going to go in this has to do with how do you view things like this. It was in National Geographic back in '85. This was the first magazine with a hologram on the cover. So when you looked at it and you tipped the magazine, it went from a human head to the skull. All right, but it wasn't a human. It was actually some kind of ape-like creature. And the search for early man. And this is about the time in the 50s and 60s they started teaching evolution again in the schools, and from the standpoint of general evolution. After the Scopes trial in 1925, publishers were just too scared to put it in their books because it was so controversial. And then about the 50s and the 60s, then the 70s, and by the 80s, they were speaking out very clearly against any view different from general evolution. And they started having access to a lot of things like National Geographic. Okay, so in Nature, they had this thing on African origins, lots of things. Wired had the plot to kill evolution, how creationists, where was that? Inside the crusade to bring creationism 2.0 to America's classrooms. Well, there is no such thing as that. And am I a creationist or an evolutionist? Yes, I am. That's the right answer, too. We believe in natural selection, which is one concept of evolution, but we believe in the Bible. So we are and we aren't. Depends on which part of it we're talking about. So we have all sorts of things that were in there. And so we've kind of gotten used to this thing, these charts that show how things came to be. You'll find things like the comparison of chimpanzee and human skulls. When they were a fetus, they do look very similar, but they have very different adult looks to them. Plus, these sizes are not correct. That's one of the things that wasn't put on the overhead. I have no problem if they want to compare them that way, but they need to say to students, now this is not the actual size in comparison, okay? Small to a large. And I suppose some of them could be dishonest, but if I start talking about somebody being dishonest, will I ever talk to them again? Once somebody says you're being dishonest with the way you present the scriptures, would you ever talk to them again? Because the question is no longer on the evidence, it's on your honesty. It's on your integrity. And I don't ever do that. I'm not going to say that there's a bunch of people who are dishonest in the way they present it. I understand how people can make mistakes like that if they've heard it that way their entire career, and they aren't really listening to anything outside of their field. And unfortunately, if you poll students, you will find that they believe that the most dogmatic professors they ever have are science professors, particularly biologists, and then psychology professors who are evolutionists. So that kind of dogmatism is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who just have never looked at it this way. They're not looking at evidence in two interpretations. So this kind of stuff really makes an impact on people. All of these pictures, it just seems so obvious, okay? Now, I thought it was really interesting because eventually I knew this was going to happen. They put up the thing and they put us in a human in the family tree as one of the offshoots. And that's fine. I don't mind if they do that. It's just we need to talk about what the evidence was and what the interpretation was, because this is not the only way to look at it. And we're going to go on and talk about that now. Students have to be consistent in making some kind of difference between the chemical, special, and general theories. A student, if you're really going to help them, you need to show them, you've got to teach them how to see where the evidence stops and the interpretation begins. I have lots of papers that I could hand out, and after a while, I don't care how young these kids are, they would get it. They would say, oh, they're talking about general evolution, but over here, the stuff they used to support it was all special evolution or natural selection. If you look in the textbooks, almost every major argument that is given in every major area of science for general evolution is an example from special evolution. And somebody says, well, why do you think you have to make the distinction? Because they aren't the same. It's that simple. If things can, quote, evolve through natural selection to a certain degree, all right? Now we need to talk a little about that idea of the limitations, but I did that and I got to move on, okay? But ultimately, ultimately what you're going to find is that both theories of origins, supernatural and natural, basically are outside of the realm of scientific method. You cannot prove one way or the other whether something came from non-life or whether it was created as the kind. You can't do that. And so it's out of the realm of scientific method. You're just going to have to accept it on faith. And I'm going to say this again. If you believe that somebody can teach you how to argue somebody into faith, you are wrong. You cannot be argued into faith. You can come through a reasoned explanation from somebody. You can be shown an interpretation that is far better about life than what you've ever heard before. That's about all you can do. But when it comes down to believing that God created the heavens and the earth, you will believe that on faith. And I can't ever prove that to you scientifically, and nobody can take it away from you scientifically. Faith is faith. It just means it's something that you hope for. It's something that becomes the substance of things you've never seen before. How was the Red Sea, if it was the Red Sea, how was the sea actually parted so that the Israelites could come out of Egypt on dry land? I don't know. And I don't know anymore how they managed to get into Canaan with a river that was in flood where it stopped. But more importantly, they walked across on dry land. Must have stayed that way for a while if you had 1 million or more people crossing over with their flocks. I don't know how that was done. I'm not looking for a natural explanation. Somebody says, well, the quail in the wilderness was just a coincidence that this flock of quail were migrating and so on. Fine if you want to believe that, but it doesn't go along with what the scriptures say. I believe that God acted. In the natural world, he brought another force in, and that's what it means to be supernatural. Some force outside of the natural system came in and used the natural system and changed it. to accomplish things that were signs and wonders for people in every age. The miracles, as we call them. So, let's look at the evidence from fossil men. If you read this really quickly, what you're going to see is that this is the same evidence that I had for comparative anatomy and physiology. That very first night, right? When I talked about it. Because the same argument applies. Apes and humans are really, really alike. Just like horses and humans are really, really alike. And again, what was the reason for that? They have to be alike because they're all part of the same big food web. All right, if your food tonight at dinner, whatever it was, and I won't chide you what you ate, all right, I didn't eat it tonight. I'll eat afterwards. It was either plant or animal or both or whatever. And if it did not have the chemicals that you need, if it was not enough like you to provide your sustenance, then it wasn't food. All right? It just wasn't food. If it wasn't chocolate, chocolate's in there, it's a food group. Okay? But I just want you to understand that in the skeletons, in the organ systems, the tissues, they are all pretty much alike. The way the organ systems, like the lungs, work in a horse are pretty much like yours, with some variations. Like birds can get oxygen when they breathe in and when they breathe out. Now, that's a neat system. That'd sure make marathon running a lot easier, wouldn't it? So, here is a modern man, and here's a modern ape. And this was a chart that was brought in to me by my professor in advanced evolutionary theory. I wish I had never put blue on here because at one time all of this stood out more, and now I can't get it off. This is actually a negative, a real negative. Nobody knows what that is except some of us who are older, but it's a huge negative. But the point is we're very similar. Now what we've done here, you have to understand, is we've straightened that guy out. He can't stand up like that. He has a curved backbone. One curve in it, not an S-shaped curve. So he can't really stand like that. Okay. So here's the similarities. Oh, I'm sorry. There are a lot of similarities, even in behavior. That's all right. I'll hit the other color in a minute. I do want to point this out to you. If you want to get something from the National Academy, just get their little booklet on science and creationism. Because it really hasn't changed much from back in the 70s when I was dealing with it. There's been a few things added, like molecular biology. But what they do is they take a creationist argument, okay, whatever creationism is. They take a creationist argument and they bring all of these scientific studies in there to disprove it, okay? But they don't go very deep for anybody. And basically, if you read that, you'll begin to be able to clearly spot the difference between general and special, or when they completely leave special out of it. You know, they just talk about general evolution. Studies in evolutionary biology have led to the conclusion that mankind, I don't know whether they realized what they did there, mankind arose from ancestral primates, and that association was hotly debated among scientists in Darwin's day, before molecular biology and the discovery of the now abundant connecting links. We'll get back to that a little later. Today, however, there's no significant scientific doubt about the close evolutionary relationships among all primates or between apes and humans. The missing links that troubled Darwin and his followers are no longer missing. Today, not one, but many such connecting links, intermediate between the various branches, have been found as fossils. And then it goes on to talk a little about dating methods, the age of the earth. So these are the statements that are made. All right. So do you view that as general evolution or special evolution? It's general evolution, right? Very clearly general evolution. And we'll get to some others that aren't. It's time for students of evolutionary process, especially those who've been misquoted and used by the creationists, to state clearly that evolution is a fact, not a theory, Birds arose from non-birds and humans from non-humans, and no person who pretends to any understanding of the natural world can deny these facts any more than he or she can deny that the earth is round, rotates on its axis, and revolves around the sun. What theory? General theory, right? And he says it's a fact. Wanton, or I can't remember, it's slightly different pronunciation. What does it say about me? He talked about me in there. You know, I'm pretending to an understanding, but I'm denying those facts, right? So I'm not really a scientist. So there's sort of a slam to any of us who disagree, which is the exact feeling that students get when they're in a classroom like that. It's like, oh, well, I'm not so sure I want to open my mouth. So what I tell people to do, go in, study it, learn it as well as you can, put it back down on the test the way they want it, and just keep your mouth shut. You don't have to defend it. You know, I did it as kindly as I could. I still had some things I wish had not happened to me, but I'm not upset about the results based on who was in the class and what they're doing now. So, you know, it just, I'm not sure who actually has the time to do this kind of stuff, to actually morph that. Anyway, that covers both the red and the blue, doesn't it? We're good. Okay. So here's the one that really caught my attention. It came out in Life Nature Library called Early Man. And you can still find this in used bookstores, but if it doesn't have the big fold out in the center, you don't want it. Because that big fold out to me is like classic. And that was where I began to really, truly understand the difference between evidence and interpretation. And I'll show you why. This is kind of the road from this to us. Now, this is not the way it showed up. I'll show you that in a minute. And I know you can't read that. But the way that is lined up with all of them standing up, all right, which they couldn't do, most of them could not have done, and coming on up to man, you see that progression. Now, I used to have that chart, and I can't find it right now. You know, it's not lost. It is just not where it's supposed to be, which I'm pretty sure is what it means for us to be lost. We have not disappeared. We just are not where we're supposed to be. We need to think about that. We think about a lot of other people, but we need to focus on ourselves. You know Jesus is here tonight, don't you? He is here with us tonight because there's 2 or 3 of us gathered together in his name. And sometimes we forget that little fact. I really wouldn't want to have him see me in an argument. Later on in National Geographic, they put this new one in, and it shows all of these really neat skeletons and so on. But what I think it led to was a lot of humor. This was the Oakland team, so this came from the West Coast. You know, there's just a lot of humor based on that. Java Man, Peking, Cro-Magnon, Jazz Man. You know, these guys who do these cartoons are really incredible. Oh, yes. For those of you who draw, this is the evolution of the stick man. I do love that one. Now, here we come. That's the impact that this particular chart has had. You find these things all the time, and you actually find this part of it, or this part of it, actually shown as a figure in so many books and articles, it's unbelievable. This chart made such an impact on people. Now, I could go into how you interpret the evidence, because these 3 drawings all came from the same fossil record, the same 400-piece skull. Now, this is the interpretation, and that's where you begin to realize what you're dealing with. This is an interpretation, but underneath there is something that was fossilized that people could look at, okay? So that's where we want to go with this. Now, this is the way it looked. It spreads out about that big, and it's much more. It had much more of an impact if you can see me spread it out across here. I actually laminized it so that I didn't lose it completely. All right, so this is Ramapithecus, and we're going to come back to him in just a minute. And you can see how it just goes across. There's a little overlap here. All right, until you actually get over here to modern man. Now, that's the whole chart, so it's not going to all be there. So this is the way I put it all on one chart. Okay, now what's the impact of this particular thing? Well, when my professor brought that in, he had the whole chart. If that chart is in early man, save it. It'll come out, it's in the center, it'll come out as one big chart. You just look around for that early man book, and you will have your own, okay? He brought it into class, and he said, David, here's the evidence. Where would you draw the line between ape and man? Now, based on that chart you saw, how would you have answered that? Now, you all know more right now than I knew then, just tell you that right off the bat. Well, let me tell you what my answer was. I don't know. I wasn't embarrassed to say it. I just said, Doc, I don't know. Can you give me some time to think about it? He said, sure. You don't ever want to feel like you have lost a battle because you say, I'm not sure how to answer that. You just say, I'm not sure how to answer it. You go and think it out, read the scriptures, and do all the things you would normally do. So that's what I did. But I want you to see what it said on the chart. This is written on that chart. Ramapithecus at that time was the earliest man-like primate they had found so far. It was now thought by some experts to be the oldest of man's ancestors in a direct line. In other words, this is the missing link. Okay? The human status is based upon a few teeth, some fragments of a jaw, and a palate unmistakably human in shape. Your palate, your hard palate, is where peanut butter gets stuck. Up here, you know what I mean. So that was it. So I'm reading over this chart, and then all of a sudden it dawned on me that they had just given me a list of the evidence, and they had given me the interpretation. So I went back and I redid a lot of this stuff, and I got to realizing that that was true for all of these characters. Now, was that an intentional dishonesty? Doesn't make any difference to me. But what I can do is show a different interpretation of it, and I can show where the evidence stops and the interpretation begins. And that should be important for people. I don't know why. I mean, I can't even imagine what this thing cost. It was a 16-page full-color insert that was sent out to about 40,000 people by the Time Life series. How much did it cost to put that together? I can't even grasp it. It cost me $100 to make my little series of overheads, and that was a lot of money back then, okay? But it wasn't like the hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe $500,000 it took to put the other one together and print it. So anyway, here's Ramapithecus. If this was real, it could not stand up like that. I'm just going to tell you that. It wouldn't have the right thing. So I asked one of my artist friends to work on this, okay? So I said, just draw it. I'm going to take this picture, and then I want you to draw one picture with the tissues on it. All right, all the organs and all the muscles and so on. And so she did. And I don't know whether all of that is anatomically correct, but I thought she did a really good job on it for me. And then I said, now just do the skeleton for me. So she did the skeleton. And that was pretty good too. I really do like that. And then I said, now I'm going to give you the evidence, and I want you to draw the evidence, put it in the same place, put it in the appropriate place. That's it. That's the evidence. And the rest is interpretation. So I went over to the head of the anthropology department at the University of Louisville, and I started asking him about it. And we got in there, and he said, he's very professory. There's a term for that. Anyway, he was acting like a professor and an intellectual, which I guess is fine whether you are or you aren't at a university. Anyway, and we got to talking about this, and he says, well, it's really, really easy, because if you just look at what came before it and what came after it, sorry. I thought I had it after it, but I'm going to go back here. Isn't that interesting? I tell you, I cannot get over how interesting this is. Well, I had it. I wasn't going back to that for a reason. I'm just going to go up. I know I have it. If you look at what came before it and what came after it, and I've got a series just with Ramapithecus and 3 others to sort of simplify it. That was it. How did I miss that? We're going to do, Dryopithecus, Oreopithecus, Ramapithecus, and Soloman. That's pretty good representation of that chart, right? So there was a fellow that wrote a book at the same time in 1971, and he put a chart together. Now, this guy, I'm not sure whether he was a creationist or not. I'm still a little unsure about that. But he put together a chart where he took this chart and he put down all of the fossil evidence they had for each of these characters. And he put it in a chart. Okay? Basically, what we found out was that none of these at that time, I mean, the human did, Dryopithecus did, but most of the things that came before and after Ramapithecus were very incomplete. Some more incomplete than others. So this anthropologist, he said, well, it's really easy. If you just take what came before it, what came after it, you just fill in the extra parts. And I said, well, doesn't that kind of beg the question towards general evolution if you do that? And then he sort of got this look in his eye like, whoa, who is this guy? He knew I was a graduate student in biology, but it's like, well, and then he goes, well, he's a little pompous here. He goes, well, nobody's questioned that in 50 years. And I said, but if I were to question it, how do you do that? How do you put that stuff together like that and come up with a complete organism? And then he pretty much shut the conversation down. That was the end of the conversation. He was hot. Now, that was him. He's probably not the head of the department anymore, and he may not even be teaching in college anymore. So anyway, that's what I found with Ramapithecus. And if that's the evidence and that's the interpretation, but it took me a while to do it. And once I was, in my mind, able to do that easily for all the situations I ran into, it pretty much solved the whole problem. Now, Ramapithecus is not now thought to be an ancestor of man. It's in the orangutan series. All right. Now, what's interesting to me is someplace on a shelf, there is a palate unmistakably human in shape that they are ignoring. I mean, isn't that what it said on the chart? And a palate unmistakably human. So what happened? Did the evidence change on the shelf or did the interpretation change? Well, the interpretation changed. People do that all the time. I am a taxonomist, by the way. I'm a systematist. I study mosses, which is not nearly as interesting to people as fossil men and apes. But, when I did my Ph.D., I took 51 species, and when I looked at all the original specimens, I realized there were just like 2 here in one genus and 4 here, and that was what it was boiled down to, and it stayed that way ever since I did it in my PhD. So I'm pretty sure it was right, all right? Even with molecular biology, they've established it. So I'm accustomed to looking at differences. Well, anyway, evidence interpretation, and here's the one that came out of the Bone Peddlers. This was available in 1972. So you can see what they had for Pliopithecus. You can see what they had for proconsul. You can see what they had for Dryopithecus. There's not very much stuff there, is there? But the thing that really struck me was the vertebrae. 2 and 2 for that entire list until you get to Neanderthal. Now, how in the world can you put a backbone together and know what the curve is if you don't have vertebrae? So it's evidence and then you interpret. And that's the way it is in all the books. So They will not do this for you, kids. You're going to have to learn to do it yourself. Make a distinction between chemical evolution and general evolution and special evolution. What that's my term for natural selection. And you're going to have to do it yourself. Nobody's going to do it for you. And you're going to have a lot of faith to believe what the Bible says, because right now it ain't popular. Not in this country. Really, not any place in the world. My denomination was the first denomination to accept evolution as a fact out of all the denominations. I grew up Presbyterian, but now almost all will say that and say it doesn't make any difference. And so they say you just need to be a theistic evolutionist. You need to believe, yes, God created, but this is the way he created. And I'll talk about that in the lesson on why I am not a theistic evolutionist. Okay? It is fraught with problems, and I'll show you that then. So anyway, The Bone Peddler, Selling Evolution by William Fix is the book that this came from. These are the proposed ancestors from the beginning one, which was Neanderthal in 1856. That was supposedly the link between ape-like skeletons and humans. Homo erectus, Piltdown, all of these down through here. And I do want you to notice that Ramapithecus is on here, right here. 1964, that's when it was discovered. And it was found to be an ancestor of the orangutans in 1979. All right. Now, what does this mean to you? What it means is that on a regular basis, a new common ancestor is found. That has not changed over the years. Okay? You look at it, basically you go down from 1856, 91, 1912, 22, 24, 38, 46, 59, 60, 64, 67, 79, and there'll be more that people say are the ancestor to these two groups where they broke apart. So based on the evidence of what has happened, my prediction is it will continue to happen that way. They'll continue to move it back and putting it together the exact same way. They'll have very little evidence, and they'll study things, and it'll be skulls. It'll be things that fossilize. And I want you to remember, there is no way to look at fossil hearts. They're all gone. There's no way to look at fossil brains. They're all gone, except a few of my friends. They're all gone. There's no way to look at a fossil visual system because they're all gone. I had a chart that I got out of one of the vertebrate anatomy books, the longer version of Romer's vertebrate anatomy. And it showed all the hearts, and where they came from and so on. And I realized that all the hearts they were showing were modern. You can go out and find them anytime you want. And all of those lines were just lines. They were just some supposed concept there, because there are no hearts that are fossilized. So there's nothing to work with. So I want you to think, what do you learn from x-rays? We take x-rays all the time. Y'all ever seen an x-ray of your arm or your leg or your body? What does it tell you? How much hair did you have? What color was your hair? Can you tell me that? That's kind of what you're dealing with the x-rays. That, by the way, was given to me by one of my friends who's a radiologist. You don't learn much from those x-rays. Just having the bones is not enough, even if you had them all. And on top of that, even if you had the whole organism, and you were sure you had the whole organism, and you knew what color the wings were and the colors of the feathers like they do with Archaeopteryx, all right, in the drawings, you still would not know whether something could fly or not just by having that. And you certainly cannot tell whether something is ape or human without being able to observe its behavior. You just can't. So you need to be really, really careful about saying that Neanderthal was the common ancestor, because that was the original one. But the problem is that now they say it's human. And the reason they say it's human is because they found artifacts that show it probably had religion because they buried their dead. They had rituals. Okay? So you just have to have faith and not worry about it. This is Neanderthal, or this is the thing that Fred Flintstone and Barney Rubble were based on right here. These are 3 drawings of the same skull. These are all Neanderthal, or Zinjanthropus, Zinjanthropus, which had 4,000 parts. Okay, but you can't do anything on the hair and all. So this actually was in Science magazine, I want to say around 1980, where they actually explained how they did this, but it wasn't for general evolution, it was for forensic pathology, forensics, CSI kind of stuff. If you take the skeleton, and this, I agree with all of this, within limits, but if you take the skeleton, you can see where the muscles were attached and know whether they were big, strong muscles or really small, fine muscles and so on. You can figure that out. And so they will put all of this stuff together and they can come up with something. All right. There's a human, right? You got a human there. So, yeah, he looks pretty human, right? So anyway, you can dress him up and you can say, yeah, I'm even more sure he's a human, right? I've seen people like that sitting on the bus. Oh, I meant to tell you, this is Neanderthal. This is the same skull we looked at a minute ago. This is the way they draw it now, okay? Right like that. Big difference between them? What was the real difference between them? It was the face and all the hair, right? All that hair, all that interpretation stuff that was on there. That's what swings you one way or the other. Now, the truth is, if you do not know the habits, if you cannot look at the way they act in the wild, if you cannot see how they look, then you have no particular right to put it down, okay? You have a right to put it down, but you need to say, by the way, this is my interpretation, not the evidence. All right. So U.S. News and World Report had some things, and you would swear that this was written by a creationist. For years, scenes from the daily life of our ancient ancestors have been rendered with a dab of science and a bucket full of speculation. I've heard preachers say that for years. This is not that kind of person. Based on as much on wishful thinking or intellectual fashion as the scanty fossil evidence left by our ancestors, the portrayals of early man at various times suggested he was a violent ape, a noble hunter, or a cooperative food sharer living in harmony with nature. There's a new emerging view, is what this whole article was about, and a very modern one, of early and modern man, is the result not of, get this, not of new fossil finds, but of a striking shift in attitude among paleoanthropologists. So I guess the shift in the attitude is what takes the palate that's unmistakably human in shape and says, no, I don't believe that's human. I don't believe that's a missing link. Okay? So anyway, researchers realize that in the past they often reconstructed our ancestors' lives by starting with assumptions. What's a synonym of assumptions? It's a guess. It's just a guess. Assumptions have to be proved. Starting with an assumption about what early humans ought to be like, and then searching for fossil evidence to support the assumptions. As a result, many of the past scenarios of how early humans lived, while containing elements of truth, told more about the modern humans that devised them than the ancient hominids they purported to describe. So you can learn a lot more about paleoanthropologists from this kind of discussion than you actually learn about anthropology. And that is a fact. There's no way to get around it. So anyway, as I told you, these are pictures out of National Geographic. This is the way they stand. They've got one curve in their back and they can't stand up straight. So it seems like one place that we could start would be to say, if they can't stand up straight, could you please not put them up straight for your picture? I don't care how much you want them to stand up straight at the family reunion so you can get a picture of everybody. They can't stand up straight. They do not have the curves necessary to do that. And they're still being drawn with hair. This is the latest one, by the way, out of National Geographic. And every one of these is drawn with hair, and they're all standing up straight. Kind of amazing, isn't it? Oh, that's shameful. Y'all are so dull tonight. So anyway, you see the point I'm trying to make on that. Now let me just ask you this as we finish. First of all, how many people think they know who these people are? You think you know one? What is it? Okay. Wilt Chamberlain and Willie Shoemaker, right? Famous basketball player, one of the most famous jockeys of all time. I'm a little ashamed of you, since we are in Kentucky, that we did not all know that. It'll get a little dated. So let me just ask you a question. If you found just their fossil bones in the earth, would you say they were the same species? Just by looking at them here, would you say they were the same species? Well, they're all dressed up. Yeah, you got to say that. If you look at the variation in human skeletons, it's almost ludicrous to take one or two skeletons and think that you can explain an entire generation. Because I'm pretty sure that once you get to know an ape, there are really beautiful ape women, and there are really ugly ape women, and there are some that have a sense of humor and some that don't. Okay? Some that just sort of flip that switch and some that don't. So the point is, there's a difference in all of them. You're just not accustomed to looking for it. Which is true for cockroaches, which you're not going to go find out, are you? That's not going to be it. So I think that they would not be put in the same species from their skeleton. And certainly if they knew that one was one color and one was another, they would not have put them in the same species. Certainly not at that time. So just remember what we have. We have skeletons. That's all we have to work with, little pieces of skeletons. No tissue anywhere. No organs anywhere. Now, what's the point on all of this? Well, it's the same point I tried to make in comparative anatomy and physiology. You could answer this whole argument here with what I covered as my conclusion in comparative anatomy and physiology. Well, of course they're alike. They're all part of the same big food web. The similarity must be there. There's no way to get around it. If you want all organisms to be based on a food web that includes all organisms, they got to have the same molecules, or you can't have proteins and you can't have carbohydrates and lipids and so on. You got to have that. That would be an answer to it. But the rest of this shows that once a person gets caught up in one interpretation, they have great difficulty giving it up, particularly when they want to say that science is fact and faith is fiction. That's really where it comes from. I believe on the basis of faith, and that doesn't bother me. But I have a reasoned faith. You remember the passage I put up from Peter that first day? Be ready always to give an answer to any man that asks you a reason of the hope that's in you. The more you study the scriptures, the more you're going to find this out, that the scriptures will give you the most full view, logical view of mankind than anything else. That includes behavior. It includes everything. It includes everything in our life, every interrelationship that we have. And because God made us, He knows best how we should live in the body that He gave us. And there is an afterlife. All of that's on faith, right? But it's a reasoned faith. And I'm comfortable with that. Now, we got to stop. Let me drink a little bit of water while you all are thinking of 5 questions is all I'll wait. Then I will stay here until you leave.
You'll see on television shows and movies things like forensic anthropologists and facial reconstructions and things like that. A couple questions. But first of all, is that purely science fiction, or is that based on some actual real science?
No,
to be able to reconstruct skulls with with computer softwares and things like that. Is that actual?
Yes, it's actual. If they know what the muscle structure was by looking at the attachments and so on, they can make a pretty good approximation, and they can measure it. They have these little pins they put all over the head until they kind of get the ends of the pins. They can calculate all of that. It's obviously, you can do that with